Let's wait for you to go through the technical problems and issues. Well, good afternoon, all. Welcome to our May 18th regular board meeting, and we would like to welcome any of our public who is watching and listening to us online or virtually with us wherever you may be. Thank you. So I'll call the meeting to order now at 1:01. We have the opening prayer attached, and I will call on Pastor Tagu to lead us in prayer.
Thank you, Henry. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. O God of new beginnings, we welcome today's board meeting with joy and anticipation. You have showered us with blessings and gifted us with all that is beautiful and true. As we take part in this meeting, teach us to be good stewards of the earth and generous benefactors to all those we serve. Let us be large in thought, in word, and in deed. May we put away all pretense and meet each other face to face without self-pity and without prejudice. May we never be hasty in judgment and always be generous and forgiving. Teach us to put into action our better impulses, to be straightforward and unafraid. Let us always take time for all things and make us grow calm, serene, and gentle. And, O Lord, let us not forget to be kind. We ask this through Jesus Christ our Lord and constant companion. Amen.
Amen.
Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
At 1.3, 26 land acknowledgement. We are a party to 26, and as such, we wish to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is 26 territory and a traditional meeting ground for many indigenous peoples. We recognize the diversity of the First Nations who have at one time lived across the territory, as well as the presence of the Métis Nation. Mr. Swift, do we have any public forum? See none. We go to the approval of the agenda, 1.5. Brought to my attention, we have an addition.
Thank
Trustee
you,
Miller, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to add under action item 6.6, facilitator, board and superintendent facilitator approval.
That's my second board and soup evaluation, facilitator, yes, thank you. Thank you. I see no deletions. See no changes. Can I ask for motion? Please. Please ask for the motion to approve the agenda, please.
I move that the board approve the agenda as amended.
Thank you very much. Any discussions? See no hands. I'll call for the question. All in favor? Should I have those online? Thank you. Carried unanimously. Thank you. Attached is the minutes from the April 20th meeting. Any corrections? Maybe you all have the opportunity to read and check it out. So we will move and ask for the approval of last regular meeting.
I move that the board approve the minutes of the regular meeting held April 20th, 2022 as circulated.
Thank you, Mr. Leonard. Any discussion? I see none. I'll call the question. All in favor? Carried unanimously. Thank you. Attached is the board priorities. As for your information, as we continue to work through the goals and the priorities. We'll move to 4 executive administrative reports. We'll start with the board chair report. Any question or comment? Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Under board representation, the bullet there
Mhm.
that speaks to the board chair and superintendent meeting with Archbishop Smith.
Yep.
Can you expand on that and what, I guess, what was discussed and what came out of that? If there's any action items coming out of that?
Pretty much it's a follow-up from the Truth and Reconciliation work that is being done at his recent trip to see His Holiness. So he wanted to understand what our board's doing in that vein of work to make sure that we are supporting and following and doing the work that is being spelled out in recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation, that we are moving forward in some of those. So again, boards are shared like we did. We have our PD sessions with our Aboriginal counterparts down south. Other boards have different ideas that they've been doing. Again, like we have the idea of bringing on a trustee on that day. So it's a whole variety of everything that we're doing to support the recommendations that were made from that, all that work. Right? That's basically the end of that discussion. Mr. Bouchard, anything I'm missing there?
It's a standing twice annual meeting. I guess that would be the other part that I would add, and that was the focus, as the chair has mentioned, for this meeting.
Thank you. Right. So there are no further questions. Superintendent reports. And again, everything that is highlighted is part of the work that he's doing through the board priorities. There are questions or comments? I see none.
Henry,
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna make a note about the new student from the Ukraine. Is this the only one that we have in our school district so far as one student?
That's my understanding, and the student is at Notre Dame.
All right, so we have one. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Under number 3, commitment to professional learning, the first bullet in regarding to First Nation Métis Inuit strategies. Can you, as a newer trustee, can you explain what the OECD is for me?
Sure. So that, you can see the full script there, but Alberta Education, a number of years ago, the field services rep and the First Nation Métis Inuit rep recommended this. So it's a world organization with several countries participating. And they do research on a variety of things to advance society as a whole. So they do different research studies. So they did some research studies in Australia, Canada. What other countries were there? Do you recall, or is that, those are the two main ones, I believe?
Yes, yeah, it was Australia, Canada, and other country with Indigenous people. Which I don't
Right.
remember.
So I'm very happy to speak about this bullet in the day that we had. So we brought a combination of 4 elders and knowledge keepers to central office to meet with our administrators and central office staff, where we reviewed the best practices in the document and brainstormed around ideas to move the board school forward. It was a very productive day, and it led to some new strategies in the education plan. But it was a very productive day.
Thank you. Yeah. That's the time. Thank you. Keep reminding me, please.
I was just gonna ask about the Blue Pins retreat. You've got attended. Do you mean Christy? That was here, like one of the central office staff when you put attended?
Yeah, so that was, that would have been added by the director. We, as a board, trustees that are new may not be aware, but the division and the board sponsors 16 attendees of both administrators, teachers, support staff annually to attend either SPICE or Blueprints. So, yeah, that speaks to that bullet.
Yeah, okay, I just wondered. It was excellent.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
Number 5, leading learning, the 6th bullet talks about training for staff at École Notre Dame towards universal support through leveled literacy interventions. Is this at the one school, or is this a process through all the schools, and this is just the term?
Yeah, so this would just be in this month, but all of our schools, primarily elementary schools, use the level literacy interventions as part of the work to assist students in tier 2 and targeted interventions to help them catch up, I guess I'll say. So it's a program that's served us well and that we've fully implemented. Some schools used it previously, but Notre Dame is one of the schools that has recently purchased the resource.
So this is in vain with the RCI model to try to bring us.
Correct.
Thank you. All right. See no further hands up. We will ask Treasurer Secretary if we have any money. Thank you. Any questions or comments? Noted on his report. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
One question about the submission of moving our funds from the operating reserves to the capital reserves that we heard back on approval on that.
When I've talked to the administrative team at the department about that, what they recommended at this time was to submit that at the same time that we submit our budget for 22-23. It would likely happen more quickly rather than submitting it separately and on its own. So we are taking that advice, and on approval of the budget, the submission, the document and the request and the expenditures plan will go in for 21-22, along with our budget for 22-23.
That would make sense. Want to see how much money we have?
What they talked about was timelines of standing alone of probably extended beyond the normal process would be 6 weeks. 4 to 6 weeks. It would extend it if we were doing this kind of as a standalone. So that's where that stands at this point.
Thank you. Just have one question on the transportation management. We did various identity with coordinator with regards to volunteer drivers. What do you mean by volunteer drivers? Like those mom and dads going to picking up kids to.
That and the possibility that we have a team that is going,
Okay.
and they're using volunteer drivers.
Okay.
You have a question?
Go ahead. Pass it out.
I just had a question on facilities management, that you had a preliminary meeting with the city of Lacombe regarding the development of joint use and planning agreements. I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit, how that's going.
So not sure if all trustees are aware, but under the Municipal Government Act, there is a requirement, and there is a parallel change to the Education Act that requires municipalities and the school boards within that municipality. So if we're talking about something like the city of Lacombe, or we might be talking about the county of Leduc. But each one of those has to have an agreement that covers not only joint use, but also covers planning. And so for some of our communities, we have maybe a joint use and not necessarily the planning component. For the city of Lacombe, we're actually looking at both the joint use. So under that, the concept is that we would have access to all of the municipal facilities, as well as any of our related groups, typically is what is looked at, would have free access to that. It may not include staffing. So something like a swimming pool, if you're doing lessons, we would have to pay for the staff to man the swimming pool, but we have free access otherwise. It's also intended to be reciprocal, so that access to our facilities is provided to the municipality and their recognized groups or organizations. And that varies from municipality to municipality. So my discussion with the city of Lacombe kind of outlined sort of what was their expectations, what our expectations were, and looking kind of said what we have been gathering from our administrators as we've entered into these discussions is what areas of the school would be utilized and they would have access to, which wouldn't they have access to. In some cases, we don't want them to have access to some of the classrooms because there's so much material up. We don't want anything damaged or any risk there. I can understand that. Typically, what communities want to see is access to gymnasiums, and I haven't had any resistance from there. The other thing that we also talk about is with our schools is how to handle reservations of those facilities. In some communities, that's handled by the municipality. In some of our communities, it's handled by our own school. And so if there's an increase in the volume of those kind of requests for use of school facilities, is that something that the school can adapt to, or do we look at a partnership where maybe the municipality facilitates that? The last area is also what users are accessed. In some communities, the municipality has an established policy that allows for a wide variety of user groups. It might be only limited that the user group be registered as a non-for-profit or a society. In other communities, it's the only user groups that the municipality might have is that they're own groups. So the groups that are run through their recreation department, perhaps. So it's a very broad list. So, and likewise, we share typically who our users have been. And in some cases, what will happen is we will have some overlap. And where we previously had charged a rental fee for a community user group to our schools, once an agreement comes in place, they may be able to use that facility for free. So our discussion with the city of Lacombe was kind of walking through those three areas in generalities. For the city of Lacombe, the liaison I was talking to was also an understanding about our planning processes. And as they come to the realization that although we put in capital plans and requests for schools, it's not like putting in a request or a purchase on Amazon or something like that. You can request in and it comes 6 weeks later. There's a number of things, a number of hoops that go on, and a request might remain unfulfilled for many years. So understanding that there isn't that same freedom for us in terms of building a school and what that may look like for a municipality who's doing area structure plans, setting aside sites for schools, and how far in the future they may need to plan for that or not plan for that. So it's also was bridging that understanding in terms of what our facility planning looks like and what the processes look like, so that they have a better understanding as we move forward under that planning portion of the agreement.
Thank you.
Thank you for that explanation. And again, the adjoint use has been in the work probably years ago. After we haven't finally implemented it, because we do know schools and city parks are becoming something convoluted now, right? And this is again another avenue for cities to help schools when it comes to new buildings and needed school parks and all of that to support those playgrounds and things. So we build it, but it's a community use after schools, right? So these are all some good ideas. Thank you. I see no more hands up. We'll move to item number 5, our business items. I will go to 5.1. The SGM coming up June 5th, 6th. And probably I'll ask Mr. Bishar, we have a situation to see what trustees want to do.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So at the time this item was put in the agenda, we had an issue where we didn't have hotel rooms on the Sunday at the Cambridge, only for the Monday. So that would have meant trustees would have to move between the Holiday Inn and the Cambridge. We now have some rooms at the Cambridge. We just found out today, I believe. So maybe we just want to confirm with trustees who's staying over Sunday night. And then if we don't need the rooms, we can let them go to another division who may be looking for them.
Okay, so Sunday, you catching that? Sunday, yes. So we have the 3. Jolene, are you coming? No, yes, sorry. Marilyn, are you coming?
You're muted.
I'm gonna drive, Henry.
Okay. Pastor Tagwood, you are away, right?
Yes, I'll be attending virtually.
Virtually, okay. So you catch it, myself, Pastor Lena. Okay, perfect. Thank you. That was quick and short. Okay, Pastor Bishard, I'll move back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So at the board's direction, I prepared for you a report outlining the transition numbers and some of the high-level programming at Christ the King School in Leduc. So you can see there that we've provided transition numbers between St. Benedict School and École Notre Dame to Father Leduc between grade 6 and 7. We've also outlined the transition numbers from Father Leduc to Christ the King, as well as the grade 9s moving to grade 10 at Christ the King. As far as programming goes, we kind of kept it high level categories with a bit of definition and the total number of courses. Again, in the note, the school does offer a number of courses to grade 9, but we didn't put them in here. But I'd be happy to entertain any questions or discussion on this report.
Okay. See hands up? Yeah, go ahead.
Do you have any indication of why from 20 to 21 to 21, 22, there was a drop? Is there any?
No, one thing that you can see there from the numbers, that the pattern is not very consistent. What's interesting too, from 19 to 20, we're in COVID as well. So not only is it the grade 9s, them going to Christ the King for grade 9 is fairly new, but also in there is COVID. So it's hard to really determine the pattern.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Quick question. Is it safe to say this is probably similar course offers across all our high schools? I know it may vary in certain relations, like horse riding.
I honestly would just be guessing on that. I would hate to do that.
No, okay.
I would say that all of our high schools do a pretty good job of trying to offer a good variety of courses for the size that they are.
Any further questions? No. All right. Thank you. Oh, you are still on there. 5.3, please.
All right. So just to give the board a bit of an update on Father Lacombe School. So originally the school was supposed to be ours at the end of June this year. So we had a delay, which bumped it to September 2nd. And since then we've run into another delay. So the biggest issue with the advancement of that project is that we are short 2 air handling units. And the first one I think was scheduled to come this week, I think, as we speak, but the other one is scheduled for the middle of June. Now, the air handling units are such that they need to be in place before the rest of the project can advance. So they are a real key component. They're anticipating that we're going to get it, but if not, by the middle of June, we may run into an issue because the factory that produces the air handling units, they shut down the whole plant for vacation at the end of June for 3 weeks where everybody gets a holiday. So if we don't get it in time, that could bump it even further, but we also know that there's some delays in hardwood. And we may get that in August at this time, is the anticipated delivery date. And it has to acclimatize in the space for 2-3 weeks before it can be installed. So there's a number of things, but the latest date that we have is October 31st, Halloween, for the completion of that school. So I just wanted to bring that to the board's attention that it is experiencing some delays which are not in our control or in the control of the project manager.
Thank you for the update. And if workers to be on holidays, take some summer rest, so be it. Right? We want a good work done, right? So we just have to be patient. Yeah, but
So will the school still resume opening as planned? I mean, like the kids will still go back to school regular?
Yeah, so they'll continue to go to school in the current building, which is less than ideal.
Yeah.
We were hoping that it would be a short stay, but they'll just continue in there. And depending on the exact date, at that point, we'll have to do some work with calendar to allow for a move and for having people. Luckily, the building is right close, so it's not going to be, across town, but it'll still take some coordination.
thank you. Trustee Tagwood.
My question would be around, once we get moved in, is the demolition going to happen over the winter or right away, or is that what kind of is the plan for demolishing the old part? I mean, where we are now.
Yeah, and I don't know if Ed would like to comment on that, but the original plan was that, the demolition would happen, after the move-in. It was supposed to happen all of next year. Any updates on the demolition part?
My last information was that the demolition would now be delayed until the winter. And so that the parking area to the north that's planned for that school site would not be available until later in the school year. So we'll have some challenges in terms of staff parking at the school site. And until the demolition is done and the parking lot. We're hoping the demolition would be done and the parking lot at least gravelled. So it was at a gravel seat to be used by staff during the winter and then paved in the spring. But we're finding that may not be possible even when they move to the new facility. So it'll be, that will be delayed further as well.
So until that time, staff will continue to park at the pool, the swimming pool curling center.
That's what I'm anticipating.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Thank you. If there's no further question, rest assured we'll have a new building. You just have to be patient. Okay. Item number 6, action items. We will start with, there's a lot of calendars before us, so we will look at them all together and then make the motion. Okay. We'll present that. I will give it back to Angel number 2. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm with the approval of the school calendars at our last board meeting. I now am very pleased to present to you our kindergarten calendars for our schools that provide kindergarten throughout the division. So I am open to any questions or feedback.
And I have one. I don't think I've seen my little angels with us.
They are, I believe, we'll see if we can hit refresh and you should see them. There's a few technical difficulties.
Okay.
But we are working on your Wetaskiwin Angels in there.
Okay, wonderful. Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. What does the kindergarten program look like across the division? Are they full day, half day? Are they a mix in all schools? What does that look like?
That's a good question. They are unique. Some are full-time. You'll see at St. Anthony, you'll see a full-time kindergarten programs where it's Monday to Friday, full day. There also is the half-time full day where you may come to school on Monday, Wednesday with occasional Fridays or Tuesday, Thursday, occasional Fridays. And then there are a few that are half days. So there is a mixture of all that can be offered throughout the division. So the full-time for St. Anthony kindergarten calendar would be very similar to the calendar already approved since it is full-time.
Wonderful. And looking at the kinder programs, some communities, depending the need, it's fluctuates here and there. Yeah, some years. Okay,
Oh, there you are.
we showed up. Wonderful. All right, any further questions? No or comments? Okay. If there is none, we know our kinder angels will be in school. Can I have someone make that motion for us, please? Yeah, go ahead.
I move that the board approve the 2022-2023 kindergarten calendars as presented.
Thank you. Any discussions? Comments? Okay, there is none. I'll call the question now. All in favor? All right, carried. Thank you. So go to 6.2, Division Education Plan, Mr. Bouchard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So you have before you an education plan that is not fully complete. It's missing the pictures and the published template, but the strategies and the information is in the entire package. So in speaking with the chair and vice chair, we wish to share with the trustees by the 27th of May, the full template with pictures, but due to personnel issues, we had some difficulty having that ready for this board package. But I can assure trustees that the text of what's in this plan will not change. So you have before you an education plan that is in its final year of term. So the board in the past has approved what's called a term plan. That means it doesn't change from year to year. The goals and priorities are set for 4 years. So the strategies that you see in this plan are there to meet the goals in their final year. The strategies in the area of faith, I will say, are tweaked to specifically align with the faith theme, but also the 5 marks of Catholic schools. But the faith theme heading into this next year is disciples of works, where staff, students, and parents work on the theme of expanding on witness, but also now doing charity, but also talking about how to live life as disciples of Christ. The strategies in the First Nation Métis Inuit goal, there are some new ones in there as well. And those were created in collaboration with elders, knowledge keepers, and administrators to align with the OECD best practices document that was recommended to us by Alberta Education. Other than that, what I will say is that Assistant Superintendent Cardinal and her team, for each of these goals and priorities, they've created a 4-year plan in the first year of this. So they are now moving into their 4th year of their plans. So strategies are tweaked somewhat depending on the progression of that work. For example, the third path is one of the key strategies that we use in the area of mental health. While there are conditions, essential conditions that are implemented, we are implementing essential conditions 7 and 8, for example, in the 4th year. So by the end of this year, we'll have implemented all the conditions in the third path. So those are examples of how strategies are tweaked but continue to meet the same goals and priorities that are in the plan.
Thank you, Mr. Bashad.
Maybe I'll just highlight one other thing at the end of the document. I would like to thank Secretary Treasurer Lotka with some of his work. We've at the back, you can see some pie charts, and this is more in line with the new assurance model, where we can show in the allocation of financial resources to each of the priorities and goals of the division. So that's quite useful. That is a requirement too in the assurance model, but I wanted to highlight that as something that's new in this document as well. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Welcome. Any questions, comments? Go ahead.
I just had one question on page 18. Or actually, it might be different on my top. It's right before domain 3.
Okay.
Before domain 3.
Yeah. It mentions under strategies here, it's talks.
Page 18.
Yeah, that's right. That's right there. Up.
Okay.
Perfect. So under the strategies there, it mentions encourage and hold the expectation for students to reach high levels of learning. And then it says RTI philosophy. Is that response to intervention?
Correct.
Yes. And could you maybe explain what that is?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So the response to intervention philosophy is that all students can achieve at high levels, and all means all. So the expectation is there that we'll meet the needs of all students. Response to intervention has 3 tiers. So there's basic, universal, core instruction in tier 1. Tier 2 is targeted interventions for small groups of students who need assistance. Tier 3 is intensive interventions. Those are students that often need one-on-one support. Support and programming can be academic and behavioral, so we provide that in both of those areas. But in short, as students get what they need, that's really the philosophy, so that they can be successful.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions? Okay. I have a question, and that should be. Coming on second. Oh, no, I can't find it. Okay. I can't find it. I was just going to say, you were saying now, some of our counselors in the school, you want to give an idea how much pressure are they under with everything going on in terms of our mental health support in our different communities? If you want to just explain, I couldn't find that line on the implementation of the strategy.
Okay, so the mental health supports provided to schools there. First off, we provide 2 structures in schools. There's the third path, and then there's mental health literacy. The third path can be viewed as a preventative measure. Mental health literacy is more of a response to concerns or presentations by students in the area of mental health. So when we do experience students with mental health challenges, we have family school liaison workers. We have a wellness worker that the division employs. And we also have outside agencies. We have contracted psychological services. So a combination of those, along with our director of student services, will strategize and provide supports to students as they need it.
Thank you. Yeah, but
What is a settlement worker?
Yeah, so that's a new program that we were in service on this past. So maybe I'll ask Assistant Superintendent Cardinal to speak to it. But It's an organization that's outside of education to assist with settlement, and maybe you could speak a little bit.
So SWIFT is Settlement Workers in Schools, and it is a federally funded program. And so this is all over Canada. And these organizations essentially help when we have new students to Canada and new families to Canada. So they'll help with connecting these families to outside organizations, help them, apply for a SIN number, all of those kinds of things that they need to do when they come to Canada. And also they will help with translation services for students, those kind of things. So it's just to help them orient themselves to our Canadian and Albertan environment.
Thank you. I thought that's what it was, but I wasn't.
Awesome. Yeah, go ahead.
Just a question about the third path. How long has that been implemented in the division, and do you find that it's having success in our schools?
Yeah, so we, when the board set mental health as a priority, we discussed as a senior administration if there was a model or a framework that we could use to move the division forward in this path. And we talked to some neighboring divisions, Parkland School Division as one that had been using the third path. So Assistant Superintendent Cardinal spoke with them. It was well received by them. So we've been using it the entire time that we've been journeying on this goal. So just in the last, this is going to be year 4. So it's been in the division since then. The implementation of the conditions has been a bit delayed, but that was because of COVID. Ideally, we would like to have had all conditions implemented by this year. But because of COVID and teachers being unable to have as much professional learning, et cetera, we've had to delay the last 2 conditions until next year. But I would say that it's well received. When we speak to our administration, they speak highly of it because of the relationship focus that it has. So when you think of mental health, you think that good, solid, positive relationships are essential, which makes sense. But the third path is a really good structure on how to formalize and put a model together to make it happen. So it's been well received. Anything you want to add?
No, I think what our administrators and our teachers have said essentially that these are a lot of things that they're already doing, but it's actually putting the words to it, right? So creating a sense of belonging within a school. Often that's already something they're already doing, but it gives it a name, and it also gives strategies with it. So they might be doing something, but then they can add to that, right? So there's these 8 conditions that are well researched. It's Canadian research. Dr. Tranter is from Thunder Bay, and he's at, I forget what university there, but Lakehead, thank you. And so he's very well versed in this, and it has actually been tested in schools and worked within schools before he actually released these books and this research. So.
I've heard similar to that too locally, just that, especially with the Catholic school board, it's very much, a lot of the administrators are already doing a lot of the relationships, so it works well in our schools.
Yeah, it's not something brand new that we're just putting on top, putting on top of everything else they're doing. It's like, oh, we already do this. This is great. I can maybe tweak this and that, and meeting the needs of those essential conditions. So.
Perfect.
Wonderful. We all need room for improvement. Any further questions or comments? Okay. We will, 6.2. Okay, I'll now call the question. Okay, could I have somebody please make the motion? I think we made a motion, sorry. Okay, thank you, Trustee Margot.
I move that the board approve the 2020 to 2023 education plan and revised strategies as presented.
Thank you. We've had a lot of discussion, so any further comments or discussion before we move? Okay, I'll call the question, please. All in favor? Carried unanimously. Thank you. 6.3. Have a budget report. see that. So, let's make a motion and then have all the discussions under the sun. Okay. 6.3, can I have someone please make that motion? Yeah.
I move that the board approve the budget for the 2022-2023 school year as presented.
Wonderful. Now, Mr. Lanka, I'll give that back to you for some discussion and comment.
What I'm going to walk the board through is a presentation about the budget report. The budget report itself is a series of tables and numbers. Hopefully I add more value to the PowerPoint, and then I'll walk through the budget report document. If there's any additional questions. And just give me a minute to start the slideshow, and then I can share for the trustees that are remote. Trustee Tugwood and Burke, can you see the presentation?
Yes, I can, thank you.
So with the budget 22-23, just to kind of go through. What I'd like to do is review a bit about policy and the obligations that the board has with regards to the budget. Some of the items that are included in terms of administrative procedure and the requirements that the superintendent has of the jurisdiction when formulating the budget, as well as the guiding principles. I also like to review what the environmental changes are, and then we'll go into the budget itself. So in terms of policy, there's a number of areas under policy 9, under fiscal accountability, that deals with the budget itself. Again, the board to determine the annual resource allocations, and resources are allocated to the achieved desired results. That's becoming important, and why the graphs have been included in the education plan in terms of what resources are specifically going towards targeted areas. Make budget adjustments when necessary, approve allocations of one-time exceptional funding, and approve annually the schedule of fees, including curricular, transportation, international student, and non-resident fees. So those are all of the responsibilities the board has under policy with regards to budget. And at various points through the time, we've dealt and talked about each one of these items, this being the culmination of all of those discussions in a final product. In terms of the administrative procedure context, we have the responsibilities to do an annual budget. There's an expectation that there's input from the board, from school councils, administrators, and staff as appropriate. That the budget is reflective of provincial funding frameworks, but ultimately spending authority and responsibility for expenditures are delegated to the school, subject to division procedures. So what we're saying there is that the principal makes the decisions about the spending at their school level, at a local level. We set up the framework in which those decisions are made and are guided. So in terms of developing this budget and looking at our context, again, funding is based on projections that are adjusted to actuals in the following year. For this current year, our projections were higher than our actual enrollments, and we were anticipating a recovery from the province. When the budget for next year was announced, the province also announced that they'd hold us harmless about that from that decline in enrollment. So that was a very important step. We were anticipating over $700,000 in a recovery that the province is not going to recover from our funding for this year. Some of our local context is that next year, our ATA collective agreement is currently expired. It is a two-stage process, hopefully next year. The first stage will be complete, and then the second stage, which is local bargaining, may commence. So that's part of our context. But also along with that is our terms of employment for our support staff are set to expire in August of 2022. We'll be looking to finalize that and extend those on to future years as part of this year's context, or next year's context. The province also talked about the implementation of the Transportation Task Force recommendations expected in 23-24. So our funding for transportation this year was increased by 4.6%. But we don't know what the funding will look like beyond that. And every indication is that 22-23 is going to be the year where they announce the changes, if there's changes to it, or what that funding will be looking like for 23-24. So there's a bit of uncertainty moving forward while that task force recommendations are outstanding. But of course, we have new curriculum implementation being dealt with within this budget. We have the effects of the asset retirement obligations. And this is a concept, and it's an accounting concept that basically says that because we own a building that's of a certain age, or we have land that was previously used not as a school, but as something else, we may have an obligation for remediation for hazardous materials. So in terms of our older schools, it might be asbestos. And before even a school like Father Lacombe is demolished, we still have to be concerned about whether there's any asbestos in the building, remediating it even before demolition. If it was bare land, it might have been formerly a farm site. And not all farmers had containments around their fuel tanks. They may not have had, properly disposed of oil products as they were changing oils and equipment. So you may have land that is contaminated. And when you go to sell the property, typically you're responsible for remediation, or it affects the price. So this PSAS stands for the Public Sector Accounting Standard, says that as a public entity, we should be recognizing that we have this liability with our buildings. For us as a jurisdiction, that changes how our financial statements look, because we have to account for that each year and accumulate what that cost might be once it's finally realized and we have that obligation. The other thing with the asset retirement obligation is typically with school buildings, it is not the board's responsibility. That usually is taken on as part of the cost when you are replacing the school or you are modernizing the school. And part of that project's cost is to do all that remediation at that time. So it's an interesting, from my perspective as an accountant, process where we recognize that we have this obligation, but we can't recognize that it's the province's obligation to pay for it until they actually approve a project. So there will be a few things in our financial statements that will roll through because of that. And the last thing that's part of our context going into next year is that next year represents the first year that the province is imposing a restriction on our accumulated operating surplus. So that is our unrestricted reserves as well as our operating reserves, but excluding any unspent school generated funds. So it's basically the provincial funding that's been accumulated or is unspent, and there's a restriction that's based on a percentage of our expenditures. We'll look at that a little later too. Through the budget process, we made some assumptions and risks. Most of this was covered in a previous presentation at the last board meeting. But what we have is, again, continued recovery of pandemic enrollment levels. So we've made some very conservative estimates on our enrollments for this year. Again, our enrollments we assume that they're only going to increase at 0.3%. Typically, we looked at between 3 and 4% in the past. So we're trying to mitigate any possibility of a recovery. We don't want to have to deal with that or wait for assurances from the province that they're going to mitigate that. But that also means that we've had to increase our contingencies for class sizes, as well as for staff absenteeism related to curriculum implementation. With some of our risks, we have ultra conservative enrollment, which means that if our enrollment's been too conservative, come September, when we actually see the students that are coming to the school, we may have to make more staffing decisions in the fall. Also, staffing settlements are not finalized in the budgeting process. So we have to make sure that that's one of those risks that we've mitigated. Dealing with enrollment, again, I've talked about what our enrollments are in past but here just presented again by grade division. So ECS 1 to 3, 4 to 6, 7 to 9, 10 to 12. What our trends look like over the previous 4 years, plus our projected enrollments. One of the things that we've administratively noted, grades 1 to 3, is that decline, that trend in decline. And we've talked with some of our schools where we've noted that there's a school-specific decline, and see if there's some way to address that within the community. Some of our decline is not necessarily community-driven, it's choice-driven. Again, some of our risks with, we don't want to overestimate, we don't want to underestimate because of the staffing decisions, and again, that decline in enrollment. With revenues, and again, this is straight a graphical representation of what our revenues are reported in the budget report. So you've got a comparison between 2021, 21-22, and then 22-23 as projected. Again, our budget is somewhere hovering around $1 million. As we've adjusted our enrollments, we've always, for the 2 previous years, we've over projected what our enrollments were. One is not adapting, not being aware of when we did our enrollment projections, COVID would happen, or that we'd have to be dealing with a pandemic in that response. One thing that I would like to draw your attention to is the orange section of the graph. That is our federal funding. Typically, that funding is from tuition received for students that are resident on a reserve, First Nation students that are resident on the reserve. But in 2021, we also received over $2 million from the federal government for COVID mitigation to address concerns and education requirements. So there's a very large influx that's unusual for 2021. But what we're also seeing with regards to our First Nation resident students, we're seeing a decline in their enrollments. Whether it's due to pandemic or other factors, I can't speak to, but it is a trend that we're having. Looking at assumptions with regard to certificated staff, again, we talked about the average being 104,000. So that the concept being that when we hire a teacher, we hire the best person possible. Where they are placed or what their actual pay will not impact that decision. I want to give you a sense that between this current year and next year, we're looking at decline in terms of FTE of about only 3 staff members, 3 FTEs. Again, this data is in the budget report under the staffing area, and there's 6 FTEs associated at central office or outside the school. That includes your superintendents and your directors. Most of that 2.7 is a reflection of the adjustment in enrollments as we right size based on enrollment to our schools and our staffing levels. With regards to support staff, again, we use the standard costs there. But give you an idea of what staff members we have across our FTEs across the various categories. What you'll see is our number of EAs has actually increased. Certainly as most commonly that's dealing with student needs. So we are seeing the more student needs and identification, trying to meet those needs with staff. Then we look at the custodial administrative assistants. There's a very fine line for transportation. Again, our transportation has 1 employee. They have 2 responsibilities. One's in transportation. The other responsibility is serving all of our schools in assisting with occupational health and safety, as well as safety emergency response. Let's talk about the budgets themselves. So instruction, I break into 2 components, one being what we do centrally in support of schools, as well as redivide, reallocate based on specific needs at schools. So in terms of centralized services, we've got about $4.2 million, which is about $400,000 increase in spending over this current year. Most of that is provisions that we've made for additional substitute costs, as well as long-term absences. With the implementation of new curriculum, as well as looking at our historical absences for this past year. We recognize that we've had to increase our allowances for substitutes. Long-term absences, and that's not necessarily negative things. Long-term absences can also occur from maternity leaves and those type of positive things. It's just that we're paying 2 staff members for the same position while they're absent. So in this area, when we look at certificated salaries and benefits at 43%, large portion of that deals with staff absences across the division. With regards to supplies and services, most of that is related to our technology plan. So we look at our schools as a whole, they're spending about $31.3 million across the division. On average, about $7,500 then per student. What we're anticipating is that the schools will utilize their operating reserves, their unspent funds from this year, to the tune of over $900,000. Again, we're trying to reinforce with our schools that unless there's a future purpose, you should be spending the funds you have now on the students you have now. And so we go through this process of estimating what their reserves will be and how it's being included in their budget for the following year. With that being said, there still is provisions for about $209,000 being held in the piggy bank, so to speak, whether it's for a specific purpose or it may be designated later on. So the schools are not being wiped out entirely, but they certainly are being minimized at this point based on estimates. Plant operations and maintenance, they have a total budget officially of $8.59 million. But as you can see from the chart, there's a whack of money that's just with amortization, so that's depreciation of school buildings, as well as the infrastructure maintenance renewal program, or IMR. So when we take that out of the picture, because amortization isn't real dollars that they can spend or that they can change, IMR is pretty dedicated in what it is spent on. So when you actually look at their effective budget, they've got $4.6 million. And I've got 2 percentages there, one in blue or an alternating color, and one in black. One in black is the whole pie. But the lower figure percentage is what that effective budget means. And so when we look at something like custodial maintenance staff, their overall budget is about a quarter of it being spent. When you actually look at their effective budget, they're at 46% being spent in that area alone. That's strictly on staffing in that area. On top of that, that $4.6 million also includes over $800,000 of additional monies being transferred into facilities and operations in order to maintain the service levels that we do. With regards to transportation, it's a very small budget. We don't do a lot in terms of transportation, but nonetheless, it's $1.5 million. Again, it is not self-sustaining or self-funded with provincial funding. We utilize over $200,000 in the budget process to support projected costs for transportation. One thing that's important going into next year, when we looked at our costs, is we had made no provisions to add an additional route for next year. In the past, we've allowed for one additional route. This year became a little tighter, even with the additional money coming in. And we've made no provision for an additional route. In terms of governance and system administration, that's a just over a $2 million budget. Our funding is $2 million. In order to spend the extra $30,000, I've actually increased our conservative estimate for investment income of $10,000 up to $40,000 for investment income in order to support that. With regards to governance and system administration, we cannot transfer monies like you do in transportation and O&M from the other areas. We have to live with our funding or generate revenue from other areas. For us, the easiest one for me to project or utilize is the investment income. We're not charging fees for a lot of extra things that means that we could include to increase our resource base in the administration area. The one thing that, as in this year, as we will next year, certainly, is to have the provisions for participation in First Nations. So to have a First Nations trustee on the board and represented there has been included in our costs. Again, looking at how our costs are split, 45% on certificated staff, 27% on certificated, and another 26% on supplies and services, and the small little wedge for depreciation. So that's the summary of the budget. But let's look at a few things kind of at the end of the budget, what we're left with. So our operating reserves are expected to be reduced by $900,000 overall. So that means an accumulated surplus from operations of 318. As a comparison, when we finished 2021, we were at 924. So we're certainly spending down any surplus funds. That figure also includes what the board has previously authorized at the last board meeting for the spending of unrestricted reserves. So that's the net effect of kind of this budget as well as that expenditures plan. When we're looking at our cohorts, they were over $1,000. In terms of operating days, that our accumulated surplus from operation represents about 6 days. 2021, we were at almost 19. Our cohort boards were at 18. So we're all very high. We're bringing that back down to line with maintaining a target of around 5. Keep in mind that that accumulated surplus from operation includes unrestricted reserves as well as the school-based operating reserves, net of school-generated funds. So the last slide I wanted to talk about was our unspent funds and our cap. Because this is new for 22-23, we'll be subject to a reserve cap of 3.97%. And that's based on enrollments. Previously, I had presented an estimate of around 4.06. The final figure that we got from the province is that we'll be evaluated on 3.97. Say we multiply that by our total expenditures of $51.3 million. And so what the chart represents is what 21-22 would look like, given the same kind of projected or comparison estimate at 4.06. And in 2023, what it would look like. And the green section is the excess capacity that we have in terms of our cap. So you can see for 21-22, we have very little excess. There's a very thin green line that's about $11,000 out of the $2.1 million cap. So we are spending. For 22-23, by the time we've estimated where we'll finish the end of the year at, we'd have about $1.14 million in unrestricted net reserves and about $300,000 in operating reserves, which leaves us about $700,000 of space in our cap. So we're bringing the division back into within the cap where the province, I believe, wants us to be. Certainly means that we're not sending money back to the province. That's the indication of what that cap means, is if we're over, we have to adjust down to that cap in some form or fashion. This analysis is not part of the budget report. It's just an evaluation of where we are at our ending balances for our net assets. So that ends my PowerPoint. If I may, I'll go into the budget report. And I'll do it very quickly because it's a lot of tables, the same data is there, but there are a few things that I do want to highlight in that. Sorry.
Yeah, but
Can I ask a question just on that last slide regarding the caps? Can we look at that again? So we have an amount of what our reserves are, what we are allowed to hold for reserves.
That's correct.
We've got our categories. Can you explain to me a little bit more? I think I'm confused on what the excess is. Is that what we will be over?
That's
our
what.
allowance?
So if I look at our cap, the reserve cap is $2.1 million for 21-22. So we can't have more than $2.1 million in accumulated surplus from operations. What we have in accumulated surplus from operations in 21-22, is we'd have 900,000, oops, sorry about that, 900,000 as unrestricted reserves, and we'd have 1.18 in operating reserves, which would leave us in about $11,000 in room with under that cap, 2.1.
That's the wiggle room.
That's the wiggle room.
Anything, if we spent 20,000, they would claw back 9,000.
Or if our total, let's say the bottom orange number was $1 million and our operating reserves was at 1.1 million, we'd have over somewhere around 2.18 million. We'd be over our cap by $70,000. This keeps us under, but we're at a very fine line.
Yeah.
For this current year. Whereas next year, we're anticipating most of those expenditures that the board has approved already are completed. Where we're expecting to be with our ending balances is we'll have about $1 million for unrestricted, only 300,000 in operating. So of a cap of $2 million, we have $700,000 of wiggle room, to use superintendent's phrase, that before we're looking at trying to increase spending or the province clawing dollars back. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so the green is not allocated
No.
yet.
And
We
it doesn't,
have
it's
but it's not
it's just room we have. The other example would maybe use is similar to the credit limit on your credit card. The bill totals up to $1.3 million, but you've got up to $2 million to spend or to hold in reserve.
The 700 is not money available to us.
No. It's just room that we have available.
It's if we, because I heard you say it's not
Yeah.
allocated yet. That's not, the green is not money available for allocation.
because we don't actually have that
No.
access.
No, we have about 1.3 million in reserve.
Okay.
We could have no more than 2 million in reserve.
This is what we have.
Yellow and red is what we have.
That makes sense.
Yes.
So
Okay,
that-
thank you.
So that 11,000 we can go spend it right now. All right. Make sense? All clear for you? Okay.
Can I just ask a question as well?
Go ahead.
You had made us a statement that there's no provision for any additional routes for transportation, is that what I'm understanding? So what area is that going to impact if there's no provision for an additional route, like division wide there, or in Leduc, or Macomb?
Division wide.
So what we have is what we have, essentially.
So
Yeah,
I
go
could
ahead.
ask the question. So typically that one route that you have in there, is that a contingency?
That was a contingency route. We had, there has been, the board approved that if there was 10 students wanting to transport, specifically, we looked at the specific situation of Beaumont coming to CTK for high school, we would put a bus in place. This point, every indication was that we wouldn't have sufficient. So we looked at the budget and transportation, and as we were looking at cuts, we did not put that contingency in there for it. We needed to utilize it.
So does that mean that if students from
I
Beaumont
know.
wanted to come, they would have to find their own transportation to Leduc then?
Currently, that is the case. If we had met the threshold of 10 students, then we'd be looking at that budget again and looking at putting a bus in place, because that's the will of the board and to support those parents.
Michael is thinking about Spruce Grove to make it. Go ahead.
Well, just while we're on the conversation of contingency, there was I think it was like the third or fourth slide, you talked about contingencies on staff absences due to curriculum implementation.
Yes.
Is there anything that you're thinking towards that? Like what would that be? Like why would staff be absent?
Typically, the staff are out of the classroom and have PD sessions held by
Trying to learn
Essentially,
how to teach the curriculum.
All right, Mr. Bishaya, go ahead.
Just further to that, we've noticed too an increase in our sub-utilization year over year. So we've added $100,000 in that. But with that said, we submitted a template of staff that need to be trained, and we're anticipating some money back. So that would offset that would be a savings, but that number has not been released by the government to us yet. So it will be found money, for lack of a better word.
Maybe Mr. Bouchard, if you want to give a little bit education around sub costs, how we care that, because I'm putting sometimes teachers leave and we don't pay anybody, or we just pay a sub. You want to just elaborate on that 2 hour or?
Yeah, so any of the leaves in the collective agreement are considered entitlements. That means if a staff member accesses any of those, they still are paid and the sub gets paid, so we pay twice. Okay, then, so that's why when we train staff for curriculum, they get paid, the sub gets paid. Or if they're at a funeral, they get paid and the sub gets paid. If staff apply for leave without pay, or they access the last personal day where it's a leave without pay, then we only pay for the sub cost that day. Is that what you were after, Mr.
Yeah.
Chair?
Yeah. All right. Perfect. Thank you. Okay, Mr. Laka, yeah, go ahead. We still have some money.
For our trustees that are remotely, can you see a slide that says budget report?
Yes, we do. Thank you.
Okay, so this is the actual budget report. It's what was included in your package. Like I said, I wanted to kind of highlight a few things just from it, as it's not elsewhere. In the budget report, it asks us to highlight, make some budget highlights, plans, and assumptions. The Finance Committee, I reviewed the language that was inserted here in terms of highlights, plans, and assumptions. One of the items there, the last bullet under this section, the adoption of the Public Accounting Standard 3280 asset retirement. That last figure, that $3.7 million, that is the estimate of what we have accumulated to date in terms of our retirement obligation. So you'll see that figure flowing through our financial statements in terms of impact. And it's not a positive impact, I will tell you that up front. With regards to significant business and financial risks, I also want to highlight what the held harmless meant to the division. And as I previously said, I'm a bit of the dark cloud. The held harmless provided us with $700,000 of funding, which is great. But when they announced our funding for our division for this current year, there is also $1.2 million in bridge funding. Now, originally that bridge funding was over 3 years intended to be zero, not increasing. But now we have a budget that is dependent on $1.2 million of revenues from the province. And I'm the dark cloud saying if the province does not, in some form or fashion, continue that funding of 1.2, we will be challenged as a jurisdiction to absorb that in the following year. And certainly it's an area, and why I say I'm the dark cloud, because I'm going to assume that, that the province will not continue it because it's, every indication is that it's one-time funding. The superintendent, being much more optimistic, says there are 64 other boards that are probably in the same boat. And if we're all in the same boat, the province has to address that. And certainly, if it's not a chorus of school board trustees that have already started to talk a bit about this and the impact that this mitigation and bridge funding will have on their jurisdiction, if it's eliminated, it's certainly a point for advocacy moving forward. Like I said, I'm the dark cloud looking at that as one time, but if it's everybody's problem, then it is a provincial problem. So I want to highlight those two areas in terms of what we have as a jurisdiction. I want to make that kind of reinforce that messaging as part of the budget submission. The other areas deal with our assumptions that I've presented to you in terms of our enrollments, our changes in operating reserves. With regard to our revenues and expenses, most of this I presented. The one thing that I want to highlight, just because it's In the graph, it visually it stands out. I've made it orange, so it did. That you've got this large sum and then very little in terms of federal government and First Nations revenues. So as you can see, for 2021, we had $3 million. And then when we look at the subsequent budgets, 900,000, 600,000. That $3 million, over $2 million of it was that one-time federal money that was injected into schools and school jurisdictions. So the rest, the balance, about $1 million was what we were anticipating for the students that are resident on reserve. And then how progressively we've revised our subsequent estimates of enrollments, dropping our revenue figure down to $600,000 for next year. The other number here that might stand out in terms of 1/6 comparison, looks like we've dropped almost $1 million in expenses in O&M. When we looked at that in detail, we identified that we had over exuberantly estimated our amortization expense within O&M, and we brought that back in line to what our actual should be moving forward. This page represents statement of operations in terms of revenues minus expenses by program. Then it reevaluates the expenses in terms of categories of expenses. And I'm sorry, the fine print is the fine print. I'm not going to go through this, but it does split up the expenditures in terms of the traditional areas of school board operations, instructions, facilities, transportation, administration, external services, or anything that we do that is not instruction related. Two most common that we have in our jurisdiction are canteen operations. There's no instruction from canteen, as well as any childcare. A number of our schools operate a childcare program, and it's non-instructional in nature. So that's what that external services are. But on this statement, there is a line here, and this is where I said, there's amortization of the unsupported asset retirement obligation, tangible capital assets. And it's $50,000, that's for 1 year. As I said, we've accumulated up to prior years of $3.7 million. So on an annual basis, it'll be $50,000, but because we did everything retroactive, we have to recognize the additional $3.7 million. There is included, when we look at our budgeted fees, so the fees line from our operating statement of operation, the province asks us for a better breakdown of how we expend those, or how those funds are generated, in terms of are they technology fees, are they user fees, or the fees for optional courses. Again, this is, I think, to provide information to the province when there's concerns from parent groups about fees, and education is supposed to be free. We certainly expect our schools to engage their local school council in discussion of fees at the local level to make sure that everybody understands why a fee is being charged and whether it's appropriate. By law, there's a requirement that a parent can refuse a fee if they supply the goods that were intended to be purchased by that fee. They do have that right to supply it rather than pay the fee. And there's a similar chart down below with regards to sales and other revenues. And then again, the fine print. This one I'll try and bring up a little larger. I do want to kind of get to the bottom line. It'll still be pretty fine. So this is our statement of net assets. This provides how much we have in surplus cash, as well as what we have in board-funded capital assets net of depreciation. And when we talked about the ARO, that asset retirement obligation, you'll notice here, this column is called our investment in capital assets. So that's our undepreciated value. We had $4 million. And by the end of the year, we'll have 600,000. And what that is that $3.7 million that we had to do a write down of, all being recognized for historical. And then a little later on, the 50,000 for the current year. So that's the impact that will have on our financial statements. It's not meant to impact our surplus cash. And again, the same statement, these last three columns, the $1 million in unrestricted surplus, is 373,000 in operating reserves, including school generated funds. And then there's a $600,000 capital reserve, and that is in line with the allocation of $500,000 towards renovation of the administration building, as well as the previous balance in terms of the capital reserve for any maintenance and repairs required for this building. So at the end of next year, there would be $676,000 in that capital reserve fund.
Wonderful, Mr. Doctor. So we do have some money.
We do have some money left in the bank.
Yeah.
The following statement asks us to split up our reserves between multiple years. The only thing I would highlight here is that I've anticipated that we might in 24-25 look at possibly looking at being able to enact a renovation of this building. But at this point, that's a guess on my part. This statement is important, the projected schedule of accumulated surplus from operations. Love the titles. This statement is important because this is the statement that actually goes to the minister for approval. And we'll be asking for the approval from the minister of using $838,000 of our operating surplus. Then the last two pages deal with projected student enrollments, as well as our staffing levels. And that is the budget report.
Okay, thanks.
I tried to make the graphs more exciting than the actual report. It's still numbers.
Any questions, comments? Yeah, go ahead, Michael.
I guess I just had a question about the bridge funding. So it's up to 1.2 million right now, right? And in theory, next year it could be done, game over, no more. But is our board dependent upon that? Because like, so where have we allocated? Are you able to track where we've allocated that extra money? Because we did move 1.2 million from operating and reserves. Is that where the money came from?
No. No, we've included the $1.2 million in terms of general revenues to the division and have allocated that out to our schools. So from my perspective, I would say every teacher costs $100,000 on average. That $1.2 million, if that funding is not there the following year, means that we'd have to reduce by 12 staff members across the division, which is a teacher in every school. So that's the dark cloud in me that I portray, and that's why it is a point to make sure that's why I say in some form or fashion, we need to see somewhere closer that $1.2 million as part of our ongoing budget.
So, and that's the purpose of the bridge funding was to get more students. It's supposed to allow us to pay for the increased growth in future years without having to wait for those years to come to claim it, right?
It was a pool of money that the province had set aside so that they could say for 3 years, there was $8.2 billion in the education envelope for 3 years. They had set aside a certain amount for growth in each of the subsequent years, but rather than hold it, they distributed it to boards. So in the first year, we got an allocation of that money. In the second year, money was intended to be less because the province was going to grow. That didn't happen. And in the third year, there still wasn't enough growth anticipated. So that's where in terms of that $8.2 billion, education have this money allocated, but no, not allocated out to school jurisdictions. So I believe that's why it's been slowly increasing, is because the other funding areas went down, and that pool of money that they had grew actually larger.
So they're pulling it from elsewhere.
They pulled it from elsewhere to fund it. Now the question is what will education do moving forward now that this cycle of 3 years is over?
How long can they rob people to pay for, right? So the reality will hit, and that's when it becomes a fiduciary responsibility to be mindful as to how we are budgeting and what is going on and what is coming, right? A comment I forgot about, when teachers are away, right, we always need somebody to be in front of the students, right? That's the business in which we are. Something again to bring to your attention, school generated funds, right? We have to be very careful and mindful when schools are saying, we need money, we want money, and they're generating it from parents, not earmarking it for something specific, and they're growing it, right? As a board, we made that decision again. Let's use the money we have now, and when we request for money, use it for the students we have now, not holding on for future years we don't know if it's coming or not, right? Because in the past, governments have looked at, you guys have a lot of money because they've included the school generated fund when they see the whole budget, without realizing parents are earmarking it for something. So we've always encouraged our schools, when you earmark, use it as soon as we've gotten that and accomplished that, and then parents will be happy. You want money for a laptop? We got it. Next time they will say, okay, here for another band or something. Okay. Any comments from those virtually? No? All right. So we have a decision to make. That's the budget. According to Mr. Laka, we have money to pay our bills for now. So if no any further question, I'll call that question. Okay, all in favor? Okay, carried. Thank you, folks. So we've passed our budget for 2023 school year. Thank you. Can we take 8 minutes? Come back at 2:40, please? Yeah.